My parents kicked me out for refusing to give up my college fund, then I uncovered their shocking secret about my sister. Lately, my family has been struggling a bit financially, and to do my part, I took on a job to help cover my college expenses. I figured it was the responsible thing to do. But my parents? Their expectations have been completely unrealistic. Just last week, they told me I needed to dip into my college savings to help out my sister because she was about to move into a new house and was running low on cash. For a little background, my dad left his job a couple of years ago to start his own business. Unfortunately, that happened right around the time COVID hit, and his business never really got off the ground the way he had hoped. Even so, he didn't throw in the towel, he kept pushing forward. And little by little, things have been improving. That's great for him, of course, but for a long time, it meant we didn't have enough money to keep up with the life we were used to. As for my mom, she's always been a stay-at-home parent, and working was never something she wanted to consider. So, that left us kids to figure things out for ourselves. Our parents made it clear that they'd support us until we turned 18, but beyond that, we were expected to stand on our own. They also had to prioritize their own future, especially their retirement, which meant there wasn't much left to help us out. In fact, they had already drained a good chunk of their savings just to get us through the lockdowns without too many sacrifices. So, once my sister and I became adults, we were on our own financially. A couple of weeks ago, I officially graduated high school, which means I'm 18 now. I always knew I'd have to fund my own college education, so I planned accordingly. Since I started working at 16, I managed to save up a decent amount by doing a few internships. It wasn't quite enough to cover everything, but with a student loan, I'd be able to manage. My sister, on the other hand, is 22 and recently graduated from college. She also took out a student loan, but unlike me, she never made an effort to save up any money while she was in school. That was her choice, and I don't judge her for it. But what I do take issue with is the fact that she now expects her younger brother, me, to help cover the rent for her first house. She's moving out of our parents' home for work, and she and a couple of her high school friends are renting a place together. All of them have already chipped in their share, but she's a few $1,000s short. The reason she won't just ask her friends for help? She doesn't want them to know that our family's finances aren't in great shape right now. She thinks it would be too embarrassing. Honestly, I don't get it. If they're really her friends, why would they judge her for something like that? But since she won't ask them, and our parents have already told us they can't provide any financial support past 18, that leaves me as the only option. The worst part? She didn't even ask me herself. Instead, she went to our parents and got them to do the asking for her. To be completely honest, my sister and I don't have the best relationship. We're just very different people. So, when she moved back home after college for a few weeks while job hunting, it wasn't exactly a great time for me. That's why I was relieved when she announced she'd be moving out. At the time this whole situation happened, we were all still living under the same roof, and I was preparing to start college in a couple of months. Luckily, my uncle and aunt had already co-signed my student loan, so that part was taken care of. Meanwhile, my sister was supposed to move out a few days ago, but honestly, I don't even know if that happened. 3 days before she was supposed to leave, my parents came into my room and sat me down. They explained that she was just a couple $1,000s short on rent and that they knew I had savings for college. So, they wanted me to take some of that money and give it to her. They even reassured me that she would pay me back as soon as possible, even though, let's be real, she could have just asked me herself if she really wanted to be respectful about it. The thing is, I had no idea how she even planned to afford rent in the first place. From what I knew, she had never worked a day in her life, and I didn't think she had any savings. Apparently, she did, just not enough. But that wasn't my problem. I told my parents exactly that. She knew, just like I did, that our parents weren't going to support us as adults. She had every opportunity to get a job while she was in college, and she chose not to. That was on her, not me. Besides, I had my own expenses to worry about. College was my priority. Her getting to live in some nice house with her friends wasn't nearly as important as me being able to afford my education. I honestly thought my parents would understand. Up until this point, they had never treated my sister and me any differently. But instead of seeing my side of things, they completely lost it. They started yelling at me, saying I was being selfish. Apparently, they thought it would be easy to talk me into it. I have no idea why. When I refused, the argument escalated fast. At one point, my dad just snapped. He said that if I was going to be so selfish and refuse to help my sister, then that meant I didn't value my family as much as they thought I did. And if that was the case, then they would treat me the same way, selfishly. He said that if I wasn't willing to share my savings, then I wasn't welcome in the house anymore. Basically, I was given two choices: hand over my savings to help my sister or pack my things and leave. I chose the second option. Honestly, that whole situation was humiliating. I never thought my parents would go so far as to use the fact that I was still living under their roof against me, at least not before I made it to college. But I guess, at that moment, their priority was my sister. Looking back, I think a big part of it was that they didn't want anyone knowing we were struggling financially. If my sister had been upfront with her friends and asked them to cover her shortfall, she would have had to admit that our family wasn't doing well. And since these were her high school friends, their parents would have eventually found out too. In our small, tight-knit neighborhood, news like that would spread fast. My parents have always been the type to care about appearances, so I suppose that's why they were so adamant about keeping our financial troubles under wraps. They had put in a lot of effort to make sure no one outside the family knew how bad things were, not even our extended relatives. The only ones who knew were my uncle and his wife. My uncle, my dad's older brother, had been one of the first people to invest in my dad's business, so, of course, he was aware of the situation. At first, my dad was actually against the idea of me asking my uncle to co-sign my student loan, but in the end, he had no choice but to go along with it. Since my uncle had already co-signed my sister's loan, it wouldn't have been fair to ask him to do it for me as well, but there weren't many other options. My dad hated the idea of being even more financially tied to his brother, but he had to let it slide. And it wasn't like I was going to college nearby, I was heading out of state, which meant my expenses would be even higher. Knowing all of this, I understood that their reputation meant a lot to them. They were willing to go to great lengths to keep up appearances. But still, that didn't make it any less painful when they decided to throw me out simply because I refused to play along with their expectations. It felt like a slap in the face. I was their son, yet they were treating me like some outsider just because I didn't want to hand over my college savings to my sister. The whole thing stung. It was insulting, humiliating, and frustrating all at once. But then, something clicked in my head. If their reputation and their money were so important to them, then maybe that was exactly where I could hit them back. So, right after the argument, I started packing my things. My parents didn't even try to stop me. That same night, I stuffed whatever essentials I could fit into a bag, got a cab, and went straight to my uncle's house. I felt a little guilty about barging in on him like that, but when I explained everything, he didn't hesitate to let me stay. He and my aunt welcomed me in and told me I could stay as long as I needed to. Their kids were grown and had moved out, so I ended up staying in my cousin's old room. Even after I left, my parents didn't reach out, not even once. When my uncle called my dad to try and talk things over, my dad didn't hold back. He made it very clear that if I wasn't willing to put my family first, then they had no place for me in their home. It was ironic. They had the nerve to call me selfish, yet from where I stood, they were the ones acting selfishly. For the past week, I've been living with my uncle and aunt, and they've been incredibly kind. But even so, I haven't been able to get my mind off everything that happened. They keep reassuring me that my parents will eventually come to their senses and apologize, but I don't know if I believe that anymore. Last night, I hit a low point. I was feeling frustrated, angry, and honestly, a little vindictive. I just needed to get everything off my chest. But instead of venting to my friends, I decided to take things a step further. I made a post online and spilled every last detail. I didn't hold back. I typed out everything that had happened, exposing exactly what my parents had done. Then, I hit post and set my phone aside. I knew the second they saw it, they'd start blowing up my phone, so I decided to go for a walk to clear my head. I hadn't blocked my parents on anything because, deep down, I was expecting them to reach out to me at some point. But in the whole week I'd been gone, they hadn't even checked in on me once. After about half an hour, I got back to my uncle's house, and I could immediately tell that something was up. My uncle and aunt were both serious, and when they sat me down, they told me they had read my post. They didn't think it was necessary to put everything out there like that. But since I had already done it without talking to them first, all I could do was apologize for not giving them a heads up. I explained that I had just been feeling overwhelmed and that I wanted to get back at my parents in some way. They looked a little disappointed, but they didn't push the issue. At least, on that front, I was in the clear. Then, I checked my phone. Just as I had expected, there were tons of missed calls and messages from my parents. Almost all of them said the same thing: they were right to kick me out because I clearly couldn't think about anyone but myself. They accused me of being selfish, and now, with that post, they claimed I had proven I wasn't just selfish, but also a terrible person. They were furious that I had ruined their reputation by making them look like the bad guys. According to them, I had twisted the story to make it seem like they had deliberately kicked me out when, in their eyes, I had chosen to leave rather than support my family in a time of need. They kept saying that instead of stepping up like a man and helping them, I had abandoned them. Reading those messages, I felt justified. At least now, they were feeling the same sense of betrayal that I had been dealing with all week. Then, right as I was scrolling through their texts, my phone started ringing again. It was my mom. This time, I decided to pick up. The moment I answered, I regretted it. She was sobbing like someone had died, and in the background, I could hear my dad shouting, cursing me out between her gasping breaths. It was hard to even understand what she was saying through her crying, but I caught the gist of it. She was begging me to take the post down. Apparently, a lot of our relatives had seen it and had reached out, telling my parents how unacceptable it was for them to try and force me to support them financially. People were siding with me because I was still young and had my whole future ahead of me, yet my parents were trying to take from one child just to give to the other. That just didn't seem fair. My mom, though, was trying to spin it another way. She was acting like I had twisted the story in my post to make them look like villains. But the truth was, I had only shared my side of things. It wasn't my fault that our relatives didn't agree with how they had handled the situation. And honestly, this was social media. I had every right to share my own experiences. At least I had the decency to tell the full truth and not hide any details. But my mom kept insisting that if I was going to share my side, then I should have also mentioned how they had always supported my sister and me when they could. She wanted me to put up a new post talking about how well we had lived when my dad was doing financially well, how he had made sure we never lacked anything. And I won't lie, he really had. Both my sister and I were spoiled growing up. My parents gave us everything we wanted, and they worked hard to provide for us. Hearing my mom say that made me feel guilty because, in a way, she wasn't wrong. But even so, I didn't think that excused the way they had treated me recently. Just because they had been good to us in the past didn't mean they had the right to throw me out over money now. But it was clear that, more than anything, they were upset about the fact that I had gone public with our financial struggles. If there was one thing my parents couldn't stand, it was people knowing they were having a hard time. Even though I had received a lot of support from family members and friends online, I still couldn't shake the guilt from that conversation with my parents. And it wasn't just them, my uncle and aunt had been acting a little off around me too. They hadn't said much, but I could tell they were uneasy about what I had done. At that point, I started wondering if I had actually done something wrong or if I was just being manipulated into feeling bad about it. Was I really the bad guy for exposing my parents and their financial struggles online? Edit. For some background, my relationship with my sister hasn't been great for a long time. We were close when we were younger, but over the past 4 or 5 years, she started acting differently. I never really figured out why, but I think it has a lot to do with the kind of people she surrounds herself with. From what I know, most of her friends are snarky and mean-spirited. And while she never bullied me or my friends in school, she had a reputation for being a bully to others. That's a big part of why we don't get along anymore. I just can't stand bullies. She's changed a lot, and I can't say it's for the better. These days, we barely even talk. So, when she sent our parents to ask me for money instead of coming to me herself, it felt strange. Even though we weren't on the best terms, we still spoke every now and then. She could have easily asked me directly. And to be honest, if she had, I might have actually lent her the money. But the way she handled it, getting our parents involved instead of coming to me like an adult, just rubbed me the wrong way. And it wasn't just that. She's been acting off in general, with a terrible attitude, and that's why I've mostly distanced myself from her. Update 1. So, after reading the responses to my post, I saw that people had mixed opinions about it. In the end, I just decided to trust my gut. I took the post down. Even though a lot of relatives had shown support in the comments, it didn't really mean much. It wasn't like anyone had actually reached out to me directly. It felt like superficial support, like they just wanted to say something for the sake of it. Even the relatives who had called my parents out for how they treated me never once checked in on me. That made it pretty clear that, for them, it was more about holding my parents accountable than actually caring about what I had been through. It was all just drama to them, something to talk about, something to feel included in. So, I figured there was no real reason to keep the post up. I had gotten my point across. The damage was done. It's been 4 days since I last spoke to my parents. This morning, I deleted the post. After that, I decided I needed to make things right with my uncle and aunt. I owed them an explanation more than anyone. They had done their best to be there for me, and despite that, I hadn't even run the idea of the post by them before putting it out there. Things had felt a little weird between us since then, probably because they didn't agree with how I handled the situation. So, this morning, I woke up early, took the post down, and then made breakfast for them as a surprise. They were caught off guard, but in a good way. When I apologized for not talking to them before making the post, they told me it was okay, they had just been taken aback. They also apologized for acting distant afterward, explaining that they just didn't know what to say or how to handle it. It turned out to just be a misunderstanding. We had a long talk, and I explained everything to them, how I had been feeling frustrated and humiliated by my parents, how I had appreciated their support, but at the same time, I had felt like I had to get back at my parents somehow. I admitted that maybe posting everything online wasn't the right thing to do, but at the time, it was the only way I knew how to get it off my chest. They told me they understood where I was coming from, but they still didn't fully agree with the way I went about it. And honestly, I respected that. They also explained something that I hadn't really considered before. They said that a lot of our relatives had always been jealous of my uncle and my dad. Compared to them, my dad and uncle had always been more successful, and a lot of people in the family resented that. So, naturally, when they found out that my dad was struggling, they loved it. That was part of the reason my dad didn't want any of this getting out. He knew people would take pleasure in his failure. And that explained a lot. It explained why so many of my relatives had jumped to support me in the comments, but none of them had actually reached out to check in. They didn't care about me. They just wanted to see my dad knocked down a peg. It became clear to me that a lot of our relatives weren't actually supporting me, they were just happy to see my dad struggle. They didn't care about what I had been through, they just enjoyed seeing him knocked down a peg. That realization stung, but at least it taught me an important lesson. I told my uncle and aunt that I had taken the post down, and they seemed relieved. They reassured me that I was always welcome in their home, saying that I'd always been a good kid and reminded them a lot of their own sons. That led me to bring up something that had been bothering me. I was still upset with my sister. A big part of the fight with my parents wasn't just about the money, it was the fact that she hadn't even asked me for it herself. Instead, she had gone through them, which just didn't sit right with me. I wasn't expecting an explanation, I was just venting since I hadn't told my uncle and aunt about that part before. But when I mentioned that my sister had sent our parents to ask me for money, my uncle and aunt suddenly looked surprised, almost like they knew something I didn't. That reaction made me curious, so I asked them what was wrong. That's when they told me something that completely caught me off guard. Apparently, my sister had already asked them for money to cover her rent, and they had sent it to her. They had assumed that was the end of it. So, why would she need to ask me for more? I was stunned. I had no idea she had borrowed money from them at all. After talking more, I learned that while my sister was in college, she knew that our parents weren't in a position to help her, so whenever she needed financial support, she would reach out to my uncle and aunt. Her student loan covered tuition and school-related expenses, but there were plenty of other costs, and they had stepped in to help. She had never told me about it, though, because she had asked them to keep it a secret. She had promised to pay them back once she got a job. Then, just a few weeks ago, she reached out to them again. She told them she was moving into a new place with her friends and needed some money to cover her share of the rent. Since she was finally employed, she assured them she would start paying them back, so they agreed to help her out. So now I was left wondering, if she had already borrowed money for rent from them, why did my parents come to me asking for more? It didn't add up. Even my uncle and aunt were confused. They could have asked her directly, but they felt it was better for me to talk to her myself. Clearly, there were a lot of things we needed to clear up, and I knew that if I wanted answers, I was going to have to go straight to her. Update 2. It's been 2 days since my last update. After thinking it over, I decided that the only way to get to the bottom of this was to talk to my sister directly. I hadn't blocked her, and she hadn't blocked me either, so I just sent her a text asking if she was willing to talk. Surprisingly, she agreed right away. Last night, I called her, and we ended up having a long conversation. And as it turns out, none of this was actually her fault. She had borrowed money from our uncle and aunt to cover her rent, but then, at the last minute, one of her friends backed out of their housing plan. That friend decided to move in with her boyfriend instead, which meant that everyone else had to contribute extra to make up for the missing share. Since the house they were renting was already expensive, this put my sister in a tough spot. That's when she decided to ask our parents for help, just this once. But here's the thing, she never told them to come to me. She had no idea they had done that. In fact, she didn't even know we had fought over it until I told her last night. Apparently, our parents had told her a completely different version of events. They had made it sound like I was demanding money from them to add to my college savings, and when they refused, I got angry and left. She had believed them. She had no clue that the real reason I left was because they were trying to force me to give her my savings. When she found out the truth, she was completely shocked. From what we figured, our parents probably never had any intention of helping her financially. Instead of giving her money from their own pockets, they tried to push the responsibility onto me. They made it seem like she was the one asking for my help, when in reality, they were the ones trying to manipulate the situation. After working all of that out, we finally talked about our own relationship. I decided to be upfront with her. I told her the reason I had distanced myself was because she had changed a lot, she had become mean, and she had a history of being a bully. I fully expected her to deny it, maybe even get defensive. But to my surprise, she didn't. She admitted that she had been awful in high school. She said she had changed a lot in college, but when it came to me, she didn't think I'd ever want to talk to her again. She told me that she had wanted to rebuild our relationship, but every time she tried, I seemed too closed off, so she assumed it was pointless. In the end, we agreed to let the past go and try to fix things between us. It was obvious that our parents had used our rocky relationship to pit us against each other, and neither of us wanted that anymore. For those wondering, yes, she was still able to move into the new house with her friends. She had to come up with some excuse about why she was short on rent, but thanks to my post, her friends actually figured out what was going on. Instead of judging her, they stepped in and helped cover the extra cost until she could pay them back. So, in the end, her fears about being embarrassed were completely unnecessary. Honestly, I'm glad we talked. Not only did I finally get the truth, but I also got a chance to repair things with my sister. And right now, that's what matters most to me. Update 3. So, I recently started college, and I love it. It's been a few months since I last spoke to my parents, and they've officially blocked me. I'm not sure why they blocked me, because, given everything that happened, I should have been the one to block them. As for my sister, she hasn't spoken to them either since finding out the truth. We're both actively working on rebuilding our relationship, and honestly, it's going really well. It feels good to have my sister back. My uncle and aunt have stayed in touch with me, and there's actually some good news. One of their sons, my cousin, recently started working on a project that requires him to travel to my state often. So, I'll be seeing him soon, which I'm really looking forward to. As for my parents, I don't really miss them anymore. I do hope that one day, we'll be able to fix things. But if that never happens, I think I'll be okay.